of you. My name is Patricia Fernandez Kelly, and I have the great pleasure and honor to host today's event entitled The State of Hispanic Americans. This is the third in a five-part series called The State of the Nation, organized by the Office of Population Research at Princeton to showcase the contributions of demography and demographic research to questions of social justice. Videos of the two earlier segments, one introductory and the second focusing on the state of Black Americans, are available at the webpage of the Office of Population Research for those of you who weren't able to attend the live presentations. Before introducing our speakers, I would like to publicly thank our support team formed by Mary Lou Delaney and Stephen Mars, with the collaboration of Christina Phillips in sociology and Sarah Malone in American Studies. I would also like to thank our generous co-sponsors, the University Center for Human Values, the Center for Migration and Development, the Council for the Humanities, the Program in Latin American Studies, the Program in American Studies, and the Peers Migration Lab, which is called People and Cultures Across Borders. The state of Hispanic Americans is envisioned as a dialogue between four prominent Princeton academics and a notable public intellectual. I am pleased to introduce our five speakers in order of appearance. First will be Douglas Massey, the Henry G. Bryant Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs. He is an internationally recognized scholar and the topmost authority on Mexican and Latin American migration to the United States. His longstanding research project on that subject has focused on immigrants in home countries and places of destination. The author of numerous publications, he is the past president of the American Sociological Association, and among other entities, a member of the American Academy of Sciences. Noreen Goldman is the Hughes Rogers Professor of Demography and Public Affairs at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, and a beloved professor at the OPR. The author of nearly 200 articles, she's a specialist in demography and epidemiology. She has also conducted path-breaking research on the relationship between health and immigration. Ali Valenzuela is a rising star who studies immigration and politics. His focus is on Latino studies, preferences, and turnout in US elections. He has published important pieces in top journals, including the American Political Science Review, Public Opinion Quarterly, and the American Politics Review. His book, entitled Mobilizing Unity, How Identity Entrepreneurs Forged the Latino Vote, will be published by Oxford University Press next year. Daniel Padilla Peralta is an associate professor of classics at Princeton, whose work focuses on the Roman Republic and early empire. Originally from the Dominican Republic, Daniel was also a brilliant undergraduate student at Princeton who swept away every major prize throughout his 4 years at this institution. It was after Daniel received the prestigious Sachs Award, which required travel to England, that he revealed his undocumented status. Yes, he is a dreamer. His personal journey and dazzling achievements as a scholar make him into a unique presence at any event. Finally, I'm very honored to introduce Jose Antonio Vargas, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Emmy-nominated filmmaker, Tony-nominated producer, and tireless a human rights advocate. He too knows what it's like to be an undocumented American. Mr. Vargas is the founder of the not-for-profit media advocacy organization called Defined American, which was tagged as one of the world's most innovative companies. In 2020, Fortune magazine named him one of its 40 under 40 most influential people in government and politics. His best-selling memoir, entitled Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen, was published by HarperCollins in 2018. His new book, A White is Not a Country, will be published by Pantheon Books in 2023. Each of our four first speakers will now deliver 5-minute presentations. Mr. Vargas will respond for about 10 minutes. And that part of the program will be followed by more dialogue among the speakers. We will then open the floor to questions and answers. If you are interested, please put your questions or comments in the chat box so that we can entertain them. And with that, I welcome you all again. Yours is the floor, Professor Massey.
Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. One can't understand the status of Latino Americans today without understanding immigration over the past 50 years. So I want to take you back to 1970. That's about the time the concept of a Hispanic or a Latino was formed. It grew out of the civil rights movement, the passage of civil rights laws that created certain protected classes. But to have the law enforced under most circumstances and to do affirmative action, for example, you need a count of those people. And until 1970, there was no count of the Latino population of the United States. Latino population was very small, 4.7% of the US population. It was regionally isolated with Latinos and with Mexicans in the Southwest, Puerto Ricans in the Northeast, and a new and growing population of Cubans in South Florida. Various NGOs got together to lobby the census to create a Latino identifier. And they came up with a Hispanic origin question. But the census is a very conservative institution. And so they didn't want to put it on the 1970 census. And it wasn't until a federal judge ordered them to put it on the census that they did so. But it was late in the census process, and so they only put it on a 5% sample instead of a normal 20% sample at the time. So, but that's the first time we have any kind of national enumeration using a consistent standard of a group of people known as Latinos or Hispanics. In 1970, the population of Cubans was, of course, almost all foreign-born with a very small second generation that was very young. Puerto Rican migration from the island had really come to an end around 1970, and the second generation was taking over. And the Mexican population in the Southwest was mainly descended from people who migrated to the United States in the 1920s and survived the deportation campaigns of the 1930s. That was a second and third generation population, dominated by second and third generation, with the first generation dying out. And that was the state of Hispanic America at that time. In 1965, things changed, and the laws changed in ways that most people still don't appreciate. People think we have more Latinos in the United States today because the 1965 Act opened the doors to Latino immigration, but that's not true. What happened was it actually closed the doors to Latino immigration. Prior to 1965 Immigration Act, there were no numerical limitations on immigration from any country in the Western Hemisphere. And so in the late 1950s, the United States had a guest worker program with Mexico known as the Bracero program. It brought in 450,000 people per year in the late 50s. And Mexicans were migrating as permanent residents in the United States at 50,000 people per year. The 65 Act in 1965 Congress ended the Bracero program, and in the spring of that year passed amendments to the Immigration Nationality Act that put the first numerical limitations on immigration from countries in the Western Hemisphere. Then it was a hemispheric cap of 120,000, but over the next decade or so, it was ratcheted down to, in 1976, a country quota of 20,000 people per year with no guest worker program. So basically between the late 50s and the late 70s, you go from the situation where Mexico is sending about 500,000 people to the United States every year, heavily circular migration, dominated by braceros, guest workers, with about 50,000 permanent residents coming in, most of whom were circulating back and forth as well. When the doors closed, of course, the labor situation on both sides of the border didn't change. Supply and demand didn't change on either side of the border. And so the migrants kept coming. And the braceros returned as undocumented migrants entering without authorization across the border. The growers were happy to have them. Their employers were happy to have them. Between 1965 and 1979, basically undocumented migration rose to about the same level as the bracero migration had been in the late 50s. And then it stopped growing. But something had changed as the position of Mexicans and the image of Mexicans in the United States has changed, because now the migration was undocumented, that is illegal. So these migrants were by definition lawbreakers and criminals. And this started a meme that grew in potency and power over the years of a Latino threat to the United States. The Latino threat narrative is something that Leo Chavez at UC Irvine has written a lot about. And this came to dominate public discussion. And in 1986, it came to a head and led to the passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which began what proved to be a multi-decade process of border militarization. And the border militarization didn't have a significant effect in deterring undocumented migrants from coming to the United States. Rather, over time, it just deterred them from returning home once they crossed the border. As the costs and risks of border crossing rapidly escalated, migrants stayed longer and longer to avoid paying the costs, and they didn't circulate back and forth like they traditionally had. And so the net effect of our border policy was actually to increase the net rate of undocumented migration in the United States by lowering the return migration while not affecting the in-migration, and increase the rate of population growth in the undocumented population. Also, in the 1980s, we intervened in Central America as really the last major action of the Cold War in an effort to contain the spread of communism in the hemisphere and depose the Sandinista regime, which had come to power in 1979. The intervention took the form of direct military and political support for the right-wing dictatorships in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. By the second Reagan administration, we had launched and impaneled a Contra army, an army of mercenaries based in Honduras, with paying off the politicians and presidents and people in the government in Honduras to spread corruption to allow this to happen. And the end result was a series of endless waves of violence in the region that displaced people from their homes in urban barrios and in poor countryside areas. And they went northward seeking refuge in the United States. Nicaraguans sought refuge as well, but they were given a red carpet to a green card because they were fleeing a leftist government. And those fleeing the right-wing governments of Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras could not be accepted as refugees or asylum seekers, and so they entered without documents. And so a series of U.S. policies essentially created a large undocumented population as a fundamental structural part of the Latino population that we see today. At this moment, about half of all Mexican-born people present in the United States are undocumented, and for the Central Americans, it's even higher, around 2/3. When the National Academy of Sciences panel on the integration of immigrants reached its conclusions, they concluded that today's immigrants are doing much the same as immigrants in the past, integrating in the same sorts of ways and moving up the socioeconomic order in the same sorts of ways, with two major provisos, two major warnings. And those two problems were, two barriers they were facing were race, that is skin color, and legal status. And so basically, we engineered through both our foreign policies and our immigration policies, we engineered a massive growth of population that was that contained people of color in large numbers and made a lot of those people of color illegally present in the United States, undocumented. So basically, U.S. immigration and foreign policies has created today's Latino population, which is disadvantaged by a strong racial reaction against the Latino presence in the country, and by the fact that such a large share of them are out of status and without legal recourse within the United States. And that's the problem we're dealing with today.
Thank you very much. Noreen Goldman.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. So my comments are focused on the health and survival of Hispanic Americans, which I will refer to as Latinos. And because the data really let us consider heterogeneity among the different Latino ethnicities, many of my points will consider Latinos as a single group. So let me start by noting a well-known demographic pattern called the Latino Paradox. So prior to the COVID pandemic, Latinos lived several years longer than whites on average, with about a 2-year advantage 15 years ago to more than a 3-year advantage just before the arrival of COVID. And the answers as to why this is present are very complicated, but much of the survival advantage is driven by lower smoking rates among Latinos compared to whites, especially in the past. My research shows that some of this advantage also results from selective migration, primarily because unhealthy Latino immigrants are more likely to return home than healthier immigrants, so that their deaths are not counted in US statistics. Contrary to what many would expect, the survival advantage is larger for Latino immigrants than for second and higher generation Latinos. In 2016, I published an article entitled, "Will the Latino Mortality Advantage Endure?" The gist of my argument was that the mortality advantage would probably be diminished in the coming years. I noted that although Latinos have lower rates of many diseases than whites, which is what leads to their longer survival, they have higher rates of diabetes, obesity, and disability. There's also the stress of migration. My colleagues and I determined that the health of migrants from Mexico was much more likely to decline in the year or two after migration than the health of those who remained in Mexico. Why? Migrants experience many stressors, not just the dangerous and uncertain border crossing for the undocumented. Such stresses include difficulties finding employment and housing, accessing quality healthcare, coping with a new language, leaving family members behind, and facing the risks of being deported. Such stressful experiences can have a large impact on health. In contrast to my prediction, the Latino advantage did not drop in the few years after I wrote the paper. Rather, it increased slightly between 2015 and 2019, partly because whites were faring worse, but that's a story for another time. But everything changed in 2020. So let me share, I'm allowed to show you 2 slides. And so let me share this slide with you, which shows how much life expectancy at birth decreased because of COVID-19 in 2020. And it's broken down for Latinos, whites, and the Black population. And you can see the highest line in blue for Latinos, showing that they had higher life expectancy than whites for all the period in which we actually had data that distinguished Latino deaths from other groups. And you can see this dotted line of the dramatic decline of 3 years in a single year. Okay. So, I mean, that to give you some perspective of what a 3-year decline means, for each of the several years prior to the pandemic, the US as a whole experienced declines in life expectancy of about 1/10 of a year per year. Okay, so we're talking about a Latino decline in 2020, 30 times as large. That 1/10 of a year decline received huge attention from the media, in part because some of it, not most of it, was driven by the opioid epidemic. Okay. This decline for Latinos in 2020 due to COVID is slightly larger than for the Black population and is several times as large as for the white population. I should also point out that a new study just showed that the decline in life expectancy in 2020 for the US is one of the highest in the world. My colleague, Teresa Andresvey, a former OPR student, and I just estimated the impact of COVID in 2021 and found some very distressing results. So I'll show you in this next slide our findings, which I should note are based on actual deaths through early October and then predictions for the rest of the year, since we don't have all COVID deaths for 2021 at this point. And what you can see is the contrast between this light green, which is 2020 estimates of decline in life expectancy by race, and the projected full year decline in 2021. Once again, you see this really horrific, enormous decline for Latinos, larger than for Blacks and for whites as a result of COVID. Okay, so the story is that despite the availability of an effective vaccine early in the year, right, our estimated declines in life expectancy for 2021 are as large as, if not larger than in 2020. The racial ethnic gap is likely to be a little smaller in 2021 than in 2020, only because the white population is predicted to suffer a greater proportional loss in life expectancy than in 2020, not because the Latino or the Black populations are predicted to do any better. So I'll finish by discussing briefly why such a large decline for Latinos, who had the longest life expectancy among these groups prior to the pandemic, and thus might have been expected to fare relatively well with the onslaught of this infectious disease. We know there are several important factors. To summarize briefly, there are high rates of obesity and diabetes among Latinos. These are conditions that increase the risk of COVID infection, as well as COVID severity. They have high rates of being frontline workers, which means they're unable to work remotely. Among 12 groups that we studied, Latinos were the most likely to hold frontline jobs. They're overrepresented in low status jobs, which we measured by the average levels of education of workers in these jobs, and jobs with high risks of infection. These low status jobs, especially in the informal sector, are those least likely for Latinos to have protections against infection. They have poor access to healthcare, especially quality healthcare, especially for the undocumented who lack health insurance. They're more likely than most other groups to live in crowded, multi-generational households, in which obviously there's a huge likelihood of spread of infection. They're reliant, on public transport, and they often lack information about disease transmission and mitigation in the appropriate language. So our estimate of this huge impact on life expectancy for Latinos, once again in 2021, contrary to our expectation that things would not be as severe as in 2020, reflects the fact that despite an effective vaccine and a catch-up in vaccination rates among Latinos in recent months compared to whites, the longstanding inequalities that I just described persist and are especially egregious in a pandemic of an easily transmitted and often fatal infectious disease.
Thank you very much. Professor Valenzuela?
Well, thank you, Patricia, for your generous introduction. So I'm honored to be here today with such distinguished panelists to add my perspectives on the state of Hispanic Americans. And since I study US politics and the contributions that Latino voters make to our elections and campaigns, that's going to be the focus of my brief comments. So first, how about last week's elections in Virginia and here in the Garden State? In Virginia, of course, the Democratic governor, Terry McAuliffe, narrowly lost his re-election to the Republican. And in our own state of New Jersey, which historically is strongly Democratic, the Democratic governor, Phil Murphy, only narrowly won his re-election. These twin results have led to much hand-wringing within the Democratic Party about who is to blame for this relatively poor showing and why. Latino voters, as is often the case, have been cited as part of the problem for Democrats' underwhelming performance this year, continuing a trend from 2020 that I'll say more about in a minute. Now, the truth is that Latino support for the Democratic Party is soft. From my perspective, Democratic leaders are lousy about messaging, especially when it comes to jobs and the economy, and economic times are tough right now. And yet, even though many Democratic policy proposals have direct economic benefits for Latinos, Democratic candidates rarely frame their proposals in economic terms, and Republican attacks on democratic socialism and Democrat spending priorities seem to be working among Latino voters. But we actually know precious little about how the politics of COVID, economic reopening, and concerns about socialism interact to affect voting behavior among Native and especially foreign-born Latino populations. And this is an urgent question facing scholars and practitioners going forward. More generally, though, Latino support for the Democrats historically has been soft. So this is not a new development. Partly, research shows that this stems from barriers to political incorporation, including language and citizenship challenges, strict voter identification laws that disproportionately impact Latinos and other marginalized communities, and the meager substantive policy proposals addressing the concerns of Latinos. If you listen to party leaders outside of an active election campaign, you might be shocked to hear any mention of Latinos in their policy priorities. So in response, huge swaths of the Latino electorate do not see either the Democrats or the Republicans as equipped to address their concerns. And this appears to be part of the explanation for Latino voters' greater than expected support for Donald Trump's re-election last year. It's true, more Latinos voted for Trump in 2020 than they did in 2016. And that's not just because turnout was up massively among Latinos in 2020, which it was. But in fact, in 2020, there was also a sizable 9-point increase from 4 years prior in the share of Latino voters overall who supported Trump. And this shift was most pronounced in rural areas and less so in wealthier cities and urban areas. So this pattern now mirrors the pattern that we usually see among white voters. And for Latinos, by the way, it was not limited to just Florida or South Texas, but this increase can be seen in the data pretty much everywhere across the US. Now, 2020, of course, was in so many ways an exceptional year, and that may have affected voting trends as well. But its exceptional nature, I think, also offers us another way to understand Latinos' increasing support for Trump. That is, because for Latino voters, COVID-19, Trump's pandemic response, and concerns about economic reopening and socialism completely replaced concerns about immigration reform and Trump's harsh anti-immigrant and anti-Latino political rhetoric as Latino voters' most important and most animating issues in 2020. This shift in issue priorities, they had measurable effects on Latino voters. According to analyses of high-quality Latino polling data, Latinos in 2020 held a much less negative view of Trump's care and concern for the Latino community. So in 2016, at the height of Trump's anti-immigrant election, 55% of Latino voters saw the former president as hostile towards the Latino community. This figure, though, dropped by more than half to only 23% last year. Likewise, in 2016, only 13% of Latino voters said Trump truly cares about the Latino community, a figure that more than doubled to 28% of Latino voters in 2020 saying the same, that Trump truly cares about the Latino community. In addition, and importantly, in 2016, upwards of 42% of Latino voters, so almost half, said they were voting to support the Latino community, with another 34% voting to support the Democrats, and only 11% in 2016 saying that they voted to support Republicans. In 2020, however, Latinos moved in a decidedly partisan direction, with only 23% last year saying they voted to support Latinos, a drop of almost 20 points from 4 years prior, and 50% said they voted to support the Democrats, an increase of 16 points, with another 22% saying they voted to support Republicans, double the share of Latinos saying they voted to support Republicans in 2016. So these data, they strongly suggest that a large-scale shift in the centrality of immigration in the election campaigns caused major changes in the issue priorities among Latino voters, from a focus on immigration and Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric to a focus on economics and the pandemic response. And these changes, in turn, changed the Latino community's views of the former president, substantially rehabilitating his image and diminishing the weight of Latinos' pan-ethnic, identity-based partisan loyalties. In the research for my current book, I find that when instead the national political agenda is in fact focused on the issue of immigration, and Latinos are exposed to competitive partisan fights in presidential election states where they are large enough demographically to affect election outcomes, Latino voters are more often targeted specifically with pan-ethnic identity-based political advertising in both Spanish as well as in English, and they are more apt to identify in pan-ethnic identity terms, to feel like their own success is tied to the success of the broader pan-ethnic group, and they are more likely to connect their pan-ethnic identity-based vote motivations into greater support for Democratic candidates up and down the ballot. So now, thinking ahead to 2022 and especially 2024, if the economy is doing well, and that's a big if, Republicans are very likely to revert once again to Trump's race-baiting strategy on immigration, amplifying their attacks on critical race theory and deploying harsh anti-immigrant rhetoric in their campaigns. This is a racialized approach to electoral politics that Republicans have been exploiting since Lee Atwater pioneered the method in the 1960s and 1970s. This identity-based approach to politics would elevate the salience of partisan fights over immigration reform, discrimination, and the role of Latinos and Latino identity in the national political agenda. Were that to come to be, I expect to see something of a reversion back to patterns that we saw before 2020, in which Latino voters in the most competitive Latino contexts are heavily targeted with pan-ethnic identity-based political messages that help to strengthen their sense of pan-ethnic unity and to politicize these pan-ethnic attachments into greater support for the Democratic Party and its candidates. If, on the other hand, it's still about economics and the pandemic response in 2024, then Democrats need to get off their laurels and start devising messages and frames about the tangible economic benefits of their policy proposals and how these will directly impact the Latino community and what Democratic leaders have been doing to get these measures actually passed in Congress. So call your senators, especially if you happen to live in West Virginia.
Thank you. Beautiful. Professor Patricia Peralta.
With thanks to Patricia for the invitation and introduction, and with gratitude to my co-panelists, I want to offer a few words on the discursive representation of the immigrant experience and its implications for our understanding of the state of Hispanic Americans. And what I propose to do in my time with you all is to revisit in a way that I hope does not come off as narcissistic, but as a program of self-critique, a passage at the end of my 2015 memoir. And from that passage, I'll pivot to saying a few words first about the proliferation of memoiristic writing and autobiographical writing in recent years among Latino authors, and the salience or visibility of that writing for a general public. And finally, a set of still unanswered questions about the importance of exerting greater narrative control as well as political control over discourse, for which I will have some words of praise for Jose Antonio Vargas's Define American. Let me begin with a passage from the final page of my memoir, in which I wrote in a state of excessive optimism, quote, "Immigrant brothers and sisters, of course, people will yell at you that America is not yours, that you have no stake in America, no place in America, no right to belong in America. You must not let them get off lightly with saying that. You must argue, remonstrate, shout back that your hands and feet and minds are as much a part of America as theirs are. Together, we must fight to ensure that America remains not the dream of the chauvinistically minded few, but the fulfillment of hopes for many. We are in the ascendant. America is ours, and we must not concede otherwise. And to the haters, a final word. Demography is a bitch. Holla at me if you want me to break it down for you." Now, I am revisiting this passage because, for reasons laid out by several of our co-panelists, some of my optimism may have been misplaced. And in the case of demography as a vindication, or in the case of my appeal to demography as a vindication, here I have been profoundly frustrated for some of the reasons laid out by my colleague Ali. In truth, the expectation that numbers alone would catalyze into a political movement capable of enacting and sustaining far-reaching transformations in the political apparatus for immigration policy and all of the attendant primary and secondary consequences that flow out of that, has proven to be in need of a more exacting scrutiny, to put it mildly. So what is there to do? I spent a fair amount of time in the aftermath of the 2016 election, and then again in the aftermath of the 2020 returns, with work such as Silvio Torres Sayant, Inventing the Race, Latinos and the Ethno-Racial Pentagon. And these works share, as will be familiar to folks who have spent time in Latino studies, a commitment to unpacking the seductive appeal of various forms of whiteness or of white identification for historically minoritized communities in general and Latinos in particular. Had I been as discerning in 2015, 2016 as I think I am now, I would have probably also spent more time reflecting on the kinds of lessons that are crystallized in the writing of Jonathan Rosa and Vanessa Diaz on racial ontologies, for example, and the degrees to which white supremacist structures cultivate ontologies of being that furnish entry points for identification and aspirational orientation on the part of members of Latino communities. But what I want to emphasize more so than just my inability to correctly read the tea leaves is, first of all, the explosion of literature in recent years documenting aspects of the undocumented experience and the Latino undocumented experience in particular, to name only some of the most high profile, Carla Conejo Villavicencio's The Undocumented Americans, which is a real standout in my view, and about which I'll say more in a moment, as well as works that look more, again, through the vantage of biography, of autobiography and memoir, more macroscopically at the tensions of claiming and negotiating undocumented status in American life more generally. And here, of course, I am thinking of Jose Antonio Vargas's Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen. I am also interested in the ascent to visibility of publications that stress the complex and labyrinthine properties of the immigration system. So here, Valeria Luiselli's Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions, is one of the most pointed pieces of writing out in the public sphere. In all of this, the question that I find myself contending with is whether any effort at revising and reorienting public discourse towards a more progressive and emancipatory vision of immigration will of necessity involve various forms of trauma mining. In other words, whether those of us who have had experiences that lend themselves well to being folded between the pages of memoirs by leading presses will have to revisit and insistently retell the stories of these experiences for there to be any meaningful traction in the political sphere. I confess to not having any clarity on this front yet, but what I want to emphasize by way of conclusion, and here I will turn to Carla Cornejo Villavicencio's writings, is that we are at a time when action is necessary. We are facing a crisis for reasons laid out so trenchantly by Noreen. It's a crisis that imperils the well-being not just of those undocumented Americans who have been able to claim some measure of public prominence and visibility on account of Dreamer/DACA status, but of older undocumented Americans, and in fact of several generations in our families, in our communities, that are equally facing the depredations of our immigration system, but who are in some important respects even more devoid of resources with which to furnish security for themselves. Carla Conejo Villavicencio writes in pages 148, 149 of The Undocumented Americans, the twisted inversion that many children of immigrants know is that at some point, your parents become your children, and your own personal American dream becomes making sure they age and die with dignity in a country that has never wanted them. That's what makes caring for our elderly different from Americans caring for their elderly. For one thing, most available jobs for undocumented immigrants are jobs Americans will not do, which takes out the young migrants and makes them age terribly. At a certain point, manual labor is no longer possible. Aging undocumented people have no safety net. Even though half of undocumented people pay into Social Security, none are eligible for the benefits. According to the Migration Policy Institute, around 10% of undocumented people are over 55 years old. This country takes their youth, their dreams, their labor, and spits them out with nothing to show for it, end quote. So the state of Hispanic Americans, for me, is a state in which the multi-generational traumas perpetuated by the current immigration system are asserting and inscribing themselves above all on older undocumented Americans, and the lack of any sustained political movement in defense of their rights and their claims to being here is, for me, one of the great tragedies of the contemporary moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope you will agree, Mr. Vargas, that this was a unique a collection of brilliant presentations. You have the floor for about 10 minutes in order to, up to 10 minutes in order to respond, and we are eager to hear your reflections.
Well, first of all, it's really an honor to be here. Wait, am I supposed to follow Danelle now? I mean, this is crazy. I'm actually sitting here in a hotel room in Washington, D.C., and I remember distinctly being a reporter at the Washington Post in 2006 when I read a Wall Street Journal profile of Danelle. It was the first time I had ever seen a profile of a story of an undocumented person. And at the time, I was in the closet about being undocumented. And since my name is Jose Antonio Vargas, but I look like this, I just got to pass, right? At the time, I think I was probably the only Jose in DC who was a reporter. So I would get invited to all these events, like the Mexican embassy kept inviting me to things. And I'm like, yo, I'm Filipino. So that is also to say, I am privileged to be an honorary Hispanic and an honorary Latino to be a part of this event. So thank you for that. Just a couple of things, because I actually have to say that in all the years that I've been doing this work, this is probably the most layered, comprehensive conversation I've been a part of about Hispanic Americans in this country. That's not a surprise, given that this is Princeton. I will say, and again, back to Danelle, you are looking at one of the pioneers of the undocumented experience in this country. Like Carla would not have had that book. I would not have had that book. Marcelo Hernandez Castillo would not have had that book. Later next year, I just read a book by a poet named Javier Zamora called Solito. It's going to come out next year. So all these books about the undocumented experience and about the diversity of the undocumented experience would not have been possible if Danelle had it published undocumented back in 2015. So shout out to that. In hearing this conversation, I'm actually reminded by Toni Morrison, who for decades, of course, was associated very closely with Princeton. I remembered a quote in which she said, in this country, American means white, right? Everybody else has to hyphenate. I remember that in particular when I started traveling across the country extensively. Some of you may know, more than 10 years ago, following Patricia Peralta's footstep, I came out as undocumented in June 2011. By the fall of 2011, Doug alluded to this at some point. President Obama, before this conversation started, President Obama was deporting about 400,000 immigrants a year, most of whom are Mexican, and most of whom are Latina, predominantly Mexican. I know President Obama because I had interviewed him when I was covering the Iowa caucuses in 2008. And so when I raised my hand and said, hey, I'm here illegally, what do you want to do with us? I was surprised, frankly, that nothing happened. I was prepared in 2011, that same year. President Obama had deported 400,000 immigrants, and I was not one of them. So a few months after that essay, I was getting really restless, and I contacted ICE myself. I basically called them and I said, hi, I haven't heard from you. What's going on? And ended up writing a cover story for Time magazine, in which my whole goal was to show the diversity of the undocumented experience in America. Right, to this day, I mean, that cover story is almost 10 years old next year, actually. And to this day, I'm proud of that effort, because the whole goal was, how do people understand that when we talk about this issue, yes, we're talking about Latinos and Latinas, but we're also talking about undocumented Koreans. 1 out of 7 Korean American or Korean person in this country is an undocumented immigrant. Undocumented Indians, undocumented Filipinos, undocumented Nigerians and Caribbeans and people from Europe, right? So to my surprise, nothing happened to me. And so I started traveling. Before the pandemic, I've ended up doing like 1,800 events in 49 states, usually filming or participating in events. And I really pushed myself to talk to as many conservative people as possible. I think that's the journalist in me. And I'll never forget doing an event in the University of Georgia. I was invited by college Republicans. And, you know, as a person of color, I always get asked where I'm from. So I've gotten into this habit of asking white people where they're from. So I asked this young man, hey, where are you from? And he said, I'm white. I mean, he said, I'm American. And then I said, I know that, but where are you from? And then he said, I'm white. And then I said, well, white is not a country. Where are you from? He couldn't answer the question. I was wondering, was he Irish? Was he Italian? Was he German? Did he know the fluidity of whiteness and how incoherent it is that for many portions, depending on what time you came, you could be white or you could not be white. And then that occurred to me that how can this young man ask about borders and walls, about who can be here, if he doesn't even know how he got here? So that actually led to this documentary that I ended up making called White People for MTV. And I'm saying this because in many ways, what the state of Hispanic Americans in this country cannot be divorced from the state of incoherence of white America in this country. And in making that documentary, one of the things I found, MTV did an actual poll and a survey. This was pretty stunning to me. This was 2015. The documentary came out in July 2015, a month after Trump announced he was running for president. In the survey, 4 and 5 young people said that they were uncomfortable talking about race. They also surveyed that nearly half of white millennials believe that discrimination against white people has become as big a problem as discrimination against racial minority groups. And this for me was pretty stunning, having grown up in cities my entire life. Most white Americans live in a white bubble. I did not know that the typical white American lives in a town that is more than 3/4 white. And the average white person's group of friends is more than 90% white. So what does that mean? It means that for most Americans, specifically most white Americans, what they know about people of color, particularly immigrants, can be derived from the media that they consume, right? And traveling all across the South and the Midwest, for example, right, going to places that were predominantly white, the only time they got to see an immigrant was because of what Fox News was saying, what the local television, never mind what just CNN, MSNBC, and CNN, what the local TV was saying, what the newspaper was saying, and what conservative radio talk show host was talking about at that particular afternoon, right? And so that's why in creating an organization called Divine American, focusing on media narratives. And when I say that, it doesn't mean just news media. It doesn't mean just Hollywood. It also means YouTube. It means TikTok. If you go on YouTube and you type up immigration, the most popular and most viewed videos on YouTube on immigration are all anti-immigrant YouTube, right? The anti-immigrant right has created an actual infrastructure that we in the progressive movement have not been able to come up against. So here we are, fully knowing kind of the facts of I love that Danelle said that demographics are a bitch, right? And I have to say, this is where it gets really interesting. I ended up settling in the Republic of Berkeley in California a couple of years ago. And at the same time I moved to Berkeley, the Los Angeles Times came up with a report saying that for the first time, the majority of freshmen at the UC, across the UC system, right? 36% of all freshmen were Latina or Latino, followed by 35% of all freshmen were Asian. So altogether, 71% of all freshmen across all the UCs were either Latino, Latina, or Asian. And yet in this country, the way we talk about race and identity has been very much in this foundational black and white binary. So actually, this is the book project that I'm working on now. And what I've found really quite astounding about it, given media representation, is the continual lack, if not just pure erasure, of Latina and Latino life in television. Like we are living through right now, as you all know, the golden age of television. Earlier this year, Edward James Olmos, he didn't hold back when he actually gave a testimony to the U.S. House Judiciary Committee, right? And this is what he said. White Hollywood does not want to tell the real stories of Latinos. Latinos, he lamented, are in a worse place now than in 1964, when he started in the business and made his mark in Blade Runner and Stand and Deliver. Just because there are several successful Latino actors does not mean that Latinos are making it in Hollywood. That's because study after study has shown that a vast gap between the number of Latinos represented in English language Hollywood productions and their share of the population at large is completely, it's oceanic, right? A study that was done by USC found that 4.9% of speaking roles in movies in 2019 went to Latina and Latino actors. 4.9%. And UCLA's Hollywood Diversity Report last year found underrepresented 5% of the roles in scripted broadcast TV shows, scripted, streaming and all platforms, right, went to Latina and Latino actors. And this is why, for example, I befriended this incredible filmmaker, Tanya Saracho. She's the showrunner of a show called Vida, right? And she has joined about 270 Latino creators, actually writing a letter to an open letter to Hollywood, basically challenging the Hollywood community to know stories about us without us. And why is Hollywood important? And as an immigrant from the Philippines, I can tell you right now that the first thing I ever heard about America was Oprah Winfrey and Michael Jackson and Macaulay Culkin and from Home Alone. When I landed at the LA airport, I actually thought I was in the wrong country because I didn't see Macaulay Culkin, Oprah Winfrey, and Michael Jackson. I saw people that I guess were called Latinos. I didn't know what that was. The only time I ever saw Latinos on TV was the Miss Universe pageant. I got to memorize all the capitals of this countries in South America and Central America because of the Miss Universe pageant. But I didn't know that they were in America because that's what was not the narrative that was taught to us. And there was, for me, this really fascinating statistic from the Gina Davis Institute. If you're not familiar with them, I highly recommend looking at them. They cited that 80% of the media consumed worldwide is created in the United States. 80% of the media consumed worldwide is created in the United States. So if we are not changing the narrative across all of these mediums, particularly in Hollywood and journalism, continually, Latinas and Latinos and Hispanics will be not only underrepresented, not only erased, but not be seen as the Americans that they have always been. Many years ago, when I started this work, when people asked me, when you say define American, are you talking about North America? No, I'm talking about all of the Americas. Just the other day, I was actually digging through some research and trying to understand, why is there a European Union and there's no American Union? What stops that from happening, right? I can't wait to talk to General about that. I just saw him smile. So this is really an incredible pleasure to be with you all. And I'm hoping that when this book that I'm working on, White is Not a Country, comes out, it's actually Toni Morrison serves as a lodestar because of her work against dismantling the master narrative of the country. I think it's high time in a country in which 1 in 5 Americans will identify as Latino in a handful of years. And in reality right now, 1 in 4 Americans under 35, 1 in 4 Americans under the age of 35 is Latino or Latino. It is time that we rewrite the master narrative of what it means to be American in this country.
It's a beautiful, beautiful statement. We have some time for interaction among our speakers. Does anyone have a question for Jose Antonio? Does Jose Antonio have a question for any of you?
Ali, I wanted to ask Ali, I'm so glad that you talk about how soft the support is among among Latinas and Latino voters to the Democratic Party. How does that parallel with Asian American support? because I think there's this assumption, this is why the phrase people of color has always bothered me a little bit, because I feel like we keep trying to treat these two groups as monolith when in reality they're not. And this assumption that we're all progressive, that we're not just going to devolve and join, fold into whiteness, to me is incredibly troublesome. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah, so there's actually a lot in your question. So I would say two things. So first of all, you're absolutely right that neither Latinos nor the Asian American community is a monolith, right? And there are definitely subgroups. They tend to be national origin subgroups that have much more conservative views, right? So for Latinos, of course, Cubans, right, is the famous example. That where they, a majority of Cubans support Trump and Republican candidates. Now, this is changing among the Cuban population, right? So younger Cubans, they are, descendants of prior generations, prior waves of Cuban migrants. They're more democratic. They are less Republican than their forebears are. And there are also similarly, there are national origin groups within the Asian community that also espouse more conservative views, for sure. Now, you started your question though with about the softness of Latino support for the Democrats, and you asked about what that looks like among Asians, and it is there's also evidence that there's a softness as well among the Asian American community, and partly it's because of these two groups in particular, right? They're comprised of immigrants, or a huge group of them, a huge share of these two groups are immigrants, right? And these immigrants, they come to the U.S. In some cases, they're naturalizing, but they don't have the same kind of experiences with politics that native-born individuals of these groups have, and so that is part of the what limits, I guess, their attachments to the political parties. In addition to kind of some of the things that I talked about, right, where the parties are not actually addressing the concerns of these groups. There are like actual barriers, like policy and legal barriers to political engagement, which in turn limits how strongly they feel attached to these parties, right? If you're prevented from engaging in politics and in the formal forms of politics, right, then it's hard to feel like the parties are serving you and your interests. So many of the kinds of trends that we see among Latinos are also true for Asian American voters.
I was just hearing from a friend of mine who's an Asian American who said that Youngkin, the governor of Virginia now, was actually much better in sending literature in Korean and Vietnamese in different languages than the Democratic candidate was, which I thought was really, really fascinating.
In language, outreach, I think is critical for these groups that have large shares that are non-English speakers. And if the parties aren't doing that, they're really not doing their jobs.
Yep.
I actually have, not to preempt the conversation, I have two questions. One is for Doug. Doug has been a tireless participant in attempts to address questions of policy with respect to immigrants and Latinos. And I'd love him to just briefly recap what his position is on that subject. What should we or the country do? And the second one, Noreen, I thought your presentation was marvelous. And I'd love you to talk just a little bit about a comparison between Latinos and working class whites who have experienced, as I understand it, also some nefarious impacts as a result of deindustrialization, the literature, Deaton and Case, and diseases of despair. So go ahead, Doug. Unmute yourself, sir, please. Thank you.
I think the big problem with Democrats is, I agree with Ali, that they haven't come up with a narrative to appeal to Latino populations. And on the contrary, they've kind of left them alone, and they buy into the framing of the conservative wing of the Republican Party. So border enforcement is something everybody is for. It was Clinton who militarized the border. and it was Obama who maximized deportations. They buy into the rhetoric of the right that this is a terrible threat, that we have to defend the border at all costs, that the country's in peril. And if you buy into their framing without articulating a counter narrative, you're dead. You lose. There's no way you can survive. I think that's been the main problem. That really, when you look at the actual policies, the actual things the government has done, it's been a bipartisan road to white nationalism for the past 30 years. And the Democrats have sat on their hands expecting the numbers just to work their magic by themselves. Demography can be destiny, but you need to mobilize those numbers to turn out for you and to vote and to have something to believe in, to vote for. And I think the Democrats have totally failed in doing that. You see the support steadily weakening from the first Obama election, the second Obama election, to the Trump election, to the Biden election. They were promised immigration reform by Obama as a priority in his first term. And what did they get? A huge increase in border enforcement and the largest deportation campaign in American history. And that'll soften up anybody's support for a party. I think the biggest structural problem facing the Latino population today is the large share of people who are out of status. And they've been out of status for a long time now. Most people don't realize that undocumented migration from Mexico actually ended in 2008 and went negative for the next 10 years. And the undocumented Mexican population fell by about 1.6 million people. And that means that the undocumented Mexicans who are here have been here for a long time. And almost all of the undocumented adults who are present in households have US born American citizen children. So when you launch a deportation campaign to deport Latino workers, you're deporting the parents of American citizens who are the next generation of Americans. And it creates tremendous trauma, and it creates tremendous financial pressures on these vulnerable young Americans. And then, of course, the families face terrible dilemmas about whether they are going to leave their children in the United States as American citizens or take them back with them to Mexico. And the data suggests there's about 800,000 US-born American kids in Mexico with their deported parents. They're not getting the educations they would have gotten if they'd stayed in the United States. They're traumatized. They don't speak the language that well. They get bullied by Mexicans because they look Mexican, but they don't act Mexican because they were raised in the United States. And it's really a tragedy that's going on. And until we come up with a pathway to legal status for all these people, I think the weight of that burden of mass illegality is going to just continue to eat away at the population and make them less healthy, make them less socioeconomically successful, and it's spreading into the second generation because of it. And the Democrats really have to push, and somebody has to get out there and articulate the view that the United States is, in fact, the country of immigrants. We're all immigrants. Immigration is what made the country great, still makes the country great, and we should be unabashedly taking that position. But the Democrats buy into the fear rhetoric, and they try to assuage the fears with more enforcement, and then they expect the Latinos to vote for them, and it doesn't work.
Noreen?
Okay, thank you. So let me start with not directly the question you asked, but something that I think is quite interesting that happened in the COVID pandemic that compares Latinos with other ethnic groups, right? And if you look at employment in what we call these frontline jobs, people who couldn't work remotely, there are many groups that had very high exposure in the sense of having jobs that they couldn't do remotely that had high risks of infection. In fact, one of them was Filipinos. They had one, right? So I want to bring it in so because I can address Jose Antonio with this fact. And yet, when you look at the deaths, right, they're very much more concentrated in the Latino population. And part of that has to do with the status of the job, right? So if you look at Filipinos, particularly Filipino women, there's a very high representation in the healthcare industry, but it's not as Latinos in AIDS, it's as registered nurses or other medical professions, right? Not to say that people in these professions didn't face horrible COVID risks, particularly early on in the pandemic, but soon they had protection, right? They had their own protective equipment. They had employers who provided that protection. There were things in place through OSHA and other ways to protect them in their jobs in ways that Latinos simply didn't have. You know, being in food serving, food preparation, being maids, house cleaners, aides, right? And I think that's one of the reasons that we're seeing this disproportionate effect on Latinos, even though other immigrant groups and ethnic groups in general had high exposure to these jobs that could have resulted in disastrous consequences and often did. And so let me address what you said, Latino, Patricia, specifically with Latinos versus the white working class deaths of despair group. I mean, the notion in the deaths of despair is that whites were dying disproportionately from drug overdoses, alcoholism, and suicide, partly because of easy availability of opioids when it came via prescription drugs, but even later on because of failed social and economic settings, because they had lived earlier in a world where there were decent paying jobs, lifetime jobs. Their children could expect, the next generation could expect to continue as the parents did, not with high income jobs, but steady livings, jobs that paid their way, supported families, stable two-parent families that were no longer the case in communities with strong social structures, all of which seemed to be falling apart and led to a rise in deaths, horrific, but a completely different order of magnitude about what we're talking today in 2020, right? Not to minimize it, right? They, in fact, partly because of this failing of the social and economic structure for whites, I think became stronger in their anti-immigrant attitudes, in their blame for people who were getting ahead of the line, right? They had worked a lifetime, tough, long hour jobs, not super high paying, even if they were stable. And now here were these other people trying to compete for these jobs that made them very angry.
Yes, I think that is a very important point. And yes, I was going to return it to you, Mr. Vargas.
You know, I was just, and thank you so much, by the way, for being so specific about that, because I have a lot of nurses in my family, and it's been really interesting comparing the experience of my nurse with my aunties, right, who are nurses, versus I volunteer at this farming community in Salinas, California, pretty close to where I live. So it's been interesting kind of seeing the difference in responses, right, from the two communities. For this book that I'm working on, I have really dug deeper into Ronald Takaki's work. I'm sure some of you all are familiar with Professor Takaki, you know, who was really instrumental in the ethnic studies movement. And it's been interesting going through, and Doug, this is actually for you. This whole idea of Hispanic being synonymous with immigrant, when in reality, the Chicano movement, particularly in California, right? I've been trying to understand, when did those two things started kind of becoming synonymous, right? Is it, and meaning, in many ways, I was watching, for example, Harvest of Empire, right? That great documentary that based on Juan Gonzalez's book about the history of Latinas and Latinos in this country. And then the reality that with the 90s, when I arrived in this country, was really the beginning of the Samuel Huntington writing writing that book about all these people are going to replace us. But I feel as if the reality of the presence of Latinos and Latinas in this country for generations before there was a United States of America, and then this reality of Hispanic people as immigrants, those are two things that I think get conflated. And why I guess I'm asking, in what ways has that been hurtful in trying to understand the history of Hispanic people in this country?
Before I open the floor for questions, we have only a few minutes, so Doug will respond. But I also want to mention that I was very pleased that Danielle brought up culture and popular narratives about Hispanics. And I think that there is a connection there. So brief remarks on the part of Doug and brief remarks on the part of Daniel Padilla Peralta, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Go ahead, Doug.
Well, in 1970, the Latino population was overwhelmingly native-born and citizens. The Puerto Ricans were island-born, but they're native-born citizens. And the Mexicans were descendants of people who arrived in the 1920s in the boom years. And then over the next 5 decades, basically that population was swamped by mass immigration from Mexico and from Central America and from Caribbean and South America. And somewhere around the late 80s, early 90s, the term Chicano started to disappear from discussion. And really, it became more of a story about immigrants demanding their rights as immigrants and in seeking to become part of the United States. So the center of gravity in the population shifted from a marginalized minority identity, which was the Chicano identity, native-born, internally colonized, to striving immigrant identity. And the first and second generations begin to dominate the conversation. And then the fact that so much of the first generation, such a large share, were undocumented, that really allowed the Latino threat narrative to gain traction over time. And when you say immigrant to somebody, what pops into the average white American's head is an undocumented Mexican. Yep. And the average white American can't tell the difference between a Mexican, a Puerto Rican, and a Honduran. They're all just Hispanics, and they all consider them to be Mexican, probably illegal. And that's the nature of the stereotype at this point.
Thank you very much. Final words, Daniel, briefly.
Well, I know Ali, I just saw it was going to jump in, but what I wanted to flag is that in several of our answers and in the discussion unfolding, various sort of implicit assumptions about the most effective ways of strategizing around the present predicament have emerged. One strategy would look similar in some respects to the early stages of Obama's presidential self-fashioning. Just talk about the economy all the time, like talk about jobs all the time, like just focus on this relentlessly. Another strategy, and one whose sort of payoffs and limitations I had skirted around in my remarks, would think about crafting narratives of the Latino experience and possibly of the sort of immigrant and or diasporic experiences more generally, that cultivated a more empathetic orientation to, let's say, a progressive emancipatory project. I think that these are reconcilable strategies, but I mean, we would have to sort of spell out what the adoption of each would mean and how best to execute them in public view. Something that has been on my mind, especially the past few minutes, has been an experience that Doug and I had a few years ago when we did a reunions panel, one of whose other contributors was a member of Congress from Colorado, who, in response to the expert wisdom of Doug and other panelists, demeaned and denigrated expertise, basically. He resorted to the familiar trope of, well, in my district, people see undocumented immigrants claiming services, and this is what matters most to them. There was also like a streak of pronounced anti-intellectualism more broadly in several of his answers. But the more consequential revelation from that panel, one that has been confirmed time and again in a host of settings, university and university adjacent, is that there is a real deafness that is strategically exemplified by folks who would want to obstruct or stymie immigration reform and more broadly a kind of emancipatory politics. And that deafness has and here I am conscious of the ableism of the metaphor. This recalcitrance and unwillingness to heed and listen has become a default strategy among leaders of both parties. So naturally, the question then becomes, how do you make folks be more attentive to the claims of Latinos and of other immigrant communities in the US as well? And the short answer there is that we come back again to a fundamental premise about what one's model of politics looks like, whether you believe that at the end of the day, it is all just about the economy and about material incentives for forging ahead with this project, or whether you believe that there has to be some kind of supplement to this that ranges beyond the economic too. I hold no firm opinion on this front, but I think that clarity on the respective attributes of each of these positions is important.
Those are extremely excellent questions. I don't want Noreen's point to get lost in this conversation because it's being memorialized. The irony of white working class people experiencing the brunt of globalization and deindustrialization, and then turning against another group that has been very seriously damaged by the same processes. More about that. And I'm going to give you the last word, Jose Antonio. Of course, we're so pleased that you accepted our invitation. But before I do that, I'm going to open the floor for questions. There were 3 questions, but they have disappeared. So this is a good time, if you are with us, to ask questions or include comments in the chat box. Does anyone have a question?
Wait, I don't see. Okay, there.
The questions are there. It says under the answered tab.
I do not see the answered tab.
And oh yeah, there's 3 of them.
All right. Well, there you go.
Oh, Ali has been answering them.
Yes, I think so. I think so.
One thing I'd like to point out is the rank hypocrisy of our immigration policy at the moment. When we're deporting 400,000 people per year, most of them gainful employed workers. At the same time, we've dramatically ramped up our temporary worker program with Mexico. And in recent years, there have been 900,000 temporary worker entries. So we're willing to take people and extract their labor and turn them back, let them go back home. But we're not willing to accept those workers if they make claims as citizens.
A beautiful point. All right, I found the questions. One is from Emily Miller. It says, thanks, Ali, your talk was super interesting. Do you have any ideas on economic messaging that would be effective? And I think the second one is from Alejandro Shugorensky. How is our understanding of Hispanic Americans complicated by changes in Hispanic or Latino identity over time? Although I do believe, Alejandro, if you are there, that question has been answered. The question on messaging continues to linger upon us. So if anyone wants to address it, this is a good time to do so. What would you do, Ali, on messaging?
I mean, I think the point that I was trying to raise in my comments is just that, you know, all of these policies that Democrats pursue have these tangible economic benefits that I think are just so rarely talked about by Democratic politicians. You know, what I hear in terms of arguments are like, you know, moral or ethical reasons to do these things, right? You know, we need to have green jobs because, you know, the earth is warming. We need to have immigration reform because, you know, individuals need to be able to come out of the closet and you know, have a life that where they can pursue the life with dignity, right? And those are valid and you know, fine arguments, but I think when you're trying to convince someone that's not already there with you on those arguments, that the tangible benefits, that it's not just the individuals who are specifically benefiting from those policies, but there's actually these broad scale externalities that benefit a broader population. I think that's when you start to have winning arguments. And you know, we can keep the ethical you know, rationales, and those are important too. right? They sort of, I think they speak to the rightness of some of these policies. But I think we also have to have this economic dimension. And I think, Danelle, you're right, that Obama, relentlessly talked about all of his proposals in terms of economics. Like, that's all he was interested in talking about. And, he did a good job of building a winning coalition twice.
So, Jose Antonio, I'm going to hand over the floor to you for final reflections.
This actually gets back to what Doug's presentation was. To me, and I'm saying this as a journalist who used to kind of be evangelical in the way I talk about this. To me, the 1965 Immigration Act and the consequences of that act and what it's meant for the Asian American community, what it's meant for the Hispanic American community, is to me the most untold story of the 20th century in journalism. And I'm saying this, if you look at the Pew Center, right, a few years ago, saying that there are 45 million immigrants in this country. I don't know if you all know this. So there are 45 million immigrants in this country, right? 11 million of whom are undocumented. Those 45 million immigrants and their kids, documented and undocumented, will constitute 88% of the US population growth in the next 50 years. In other words, the country will become more Latino, more Asian, and more mixed race, right? Yes, demographics are a bitch, and yes, demographics are destiny. And I think what it means is altogether creating a whole new narrative of what it means, right, to be an American in this country. And I actually think part of that recreation is to get really specific. Like, this is where I think the work of Toni Morrison, for me, has been such a guide, right? Because she dared to really go specific, right? To write about Black people without the white gaze. So how do we talk about Hispanic Americans and how do we talk about Asian Americans and get really specific about what that means in our communities? There's the Pan-Asian identity, and then there's a specific identity. I was talking, for example, when I was asked to join this, that in some ways, as a Filipino, I have more in common with Puerto Ricans than I do with Koreans and Chinese, given our history, right? And so to that note, if you haven't, to me, probably the most probing speech ever given about the power of language was when Toni Morrison accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993, which just so happens was the same year I arrived in this country. Part of the thing that she said in that speech, I think I've committed it to memory now, which is narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. And that kind of recreation should be happening and is happening right now. So thank you for having me.
I cannot imagine more beautiful words to conclude this event. I also want to thank all of you because your presentations were brief but substantive. I am delighted that we were able to get you together in what I think was an extraordinarily constructive and vibrant dialogue. And thank you very much, Jose Antonio Vargas, for accepting my invitation. As I mentioned before, you have all kinds of credentials to be labeled a Hispanic. And as Hispanics in the United States, we're proud to have you among us. So thank you all speakers and those of you who have attended. We will see you in the next segment, which will soon be announced and which will focus on the state of Asian Americans. I bid you farewell. Thank you. Thank you.
Buenas noches.
Thank you, Patricia, for organizing this.
Buenas.
My pleasure.
Muy buenas.